Larkspur Crossing looked untouched beneath the Montana snow when Gideon Rourke finally came home. He wanted a quiet life with Vesper, the loyal canine who had survived years of service beside him. But Vesper refused to drink from the kitchen tap, and she was not the only dog falling sick. The deeper Gideon looked, the more he found a town trapped between poisoned water and the company paying its bills. Speaking the truth could protect their homes, but it could also cost hundreds of families their jobs and health insurance. This was no longer a battle one former Navy SEAL could win alone. It was a choice the entire town had to make. Tell us where you're watching from, share what you would have done, and please like and subscribe to help us reach 5,000 subscribers and keep these stories coming. The road into Larkspur Crossing followed the Cedar Run for 11 miles before climbing above the valley. Gideon Clay Rourke watched the town emerge through the bus window in pieces. The old stone bridge first, then the church steeple, the square roofs gathered beneath the mountains, and finally the long industrial buildings on the eastern edge that had not existed when he left. Vesper had been awake since dawn. The German shepherd sat between his boots and the seat ahead, her gold and black body steady despite every bend in the mountain road. Her right ear stood straight. The left, marked by a small triangular notch, leaned toward the glass whenever a vehicle passed in the opposite direction. She had learned long ago that the final miles of any journey carried the most information. Gideon rested one hand between her shoulders. "You're staring like you expect the town to move." Vesper did not look up. He understood the habit. For most of his adult life, arrival had meant assessment. Fences, rooftops, power lines, water access, roads wide enough for evacuation, buildings strong enough to shelter people who had no time to choose carefully. Even now, after leaving the last of those assignments behind, his eyes continued measuring distances without permission. Larkspur Crossing looked almost offensively peaceful. Fresh snow lay across the rooftops in smooth white plains. Yellow lights remained wrapped around the trees in the town square, though Christmas had passed weeks earlier. Chimney smoke rose into a clear blue sky. The Cedar Run moved darkly beneath shelves of ice, bending under the stone bridge Gideon remembered crossing on a bicycle when he was 12. The mountains beyond town were pale blue and silver in the winter sun. He had expected returning to feel like grief. Instead, the first thing he felt was suspicion. Not of the town itself, of the ease with which it seemed to welcome him. The bus stopped beside a grocery store with a green awning. There was no terminal, only a cleared section of curb and a wooden shelter half buried behind a bank of plowed snow. Gideon stood slowly. At 54, he still filled the aisle with broad shoulders, but the left knee objected after 3 hours of sitting. He waited for the stiffness to ease, then pulled his duffel from the overhead rack. The driver opened the luggage compartment and looked down at Vesper. "Service dog?" "Retired working dog." The driver nodded, though Gideon could tell the distinction meant little to him. Outside, the cold reached beneath Gideon's coat and settled against the old damage in his joints. He welcomed it. Cold was direct. It asked no questions and made no promises. A faded green pickup idled across the street. The man beside it had changed enough that Gideon recognized him first by posture. Otis Bellwether stood with one shoulder slightly higher than the other, as if he were still carrying an engine block no one else could see. He was 66 now, thin through the chest and bent a little at the spine. White hair escaped from beneath a canvas cap, and the Sherpa collar of his brown coat had worn smooth with age. A small wrench with a red-painted handle stuck from the bib pocket of his denim overalls. Otis looked at Gideon for several seconds before speaking. "You took your time." Bus made stops. "I meant the 33 years. Gideon glanced toward the mountains. That too. Otis's eyes moved over his face, pausing briefly at the crooked nose, the gray in his hair, the faint scar beside his right eyebrow. He did not ask where any of it came from. Instead, he looked down at Vesper. "And who's this?" "Vesper." Otis lowered himself carefully into a crouch. His knees cracked loudly enough to make Gideon wince. He did not reach for her. He held out the back of one hand and waited. Vesper stepped forward, inhaled once, then touched her nose to his knuckles. Otis nodded, as though she had passed a test neither man had discussed. "Smarter than your father's dogs." "My father never trained a dog." "Exactly." The laugh that escaped Gideon was small, but it surprised him. Otis loaded the duffel into the truck without comment. Vesper climbed into the rear seat and positioned herself where she could see both side windows. Gideon settled into the passenger seat, his knee angled away from the heater vent. As they drove through town, Otis narrated changes without ceremony. The hardware store had moved, the old cinema now sold office furniture. Maggie Dawson had taken over the diner after her brother left Montana. The Eastern Road had been widened twice since Calderon Thermal Systems expanded its plant. "What do they make?" Gideon asked. "Industrial coolant, corrosion inhibitors, chemicals that keep other chemicals from destroying expensive machinery." Otis kept his eyes on the road. "They employ 400 people directly. Probably another 100 through suppliers and contractors. That many? Not much ranching money left around here." They passed the plant at a distance. Low silver buildings stretched behind chain-link fencing. White vapor rose from rooftop vents and flattened in the cold air. Trucks entered through a security gate beneath a blue sign bearing the Calderon name. The facility did not appear menacing. It appeared successful. That, Gideon thought, was often more powerful. His parents' house stood north of town, where the pavement narrowed and cottonwoods lined the road. The timber siding had weathered to a muted brown, and the porch leaned slightly at the western corner, but the structure remained sound. Someone had cleared the snow from the steps. 2 window frames had been repaired with newer wood that did not match the rest. Gideon stopped beside the truck. For years the house had existed in his mind as a place held still by absence. His mother's yellow curtains, his father's boots beside the back door, the brass clock above the fireplace, always 3 minutes slow. Seeing repairs disturbed that illusion. The house had not waited for him. It had continued aging, and someone else had cared for it. "Roof is good for another winter," Otis said. "Porch needs work. Workshop door sticks when the temperature drops." "You did all this?" "Most of it." "You didn't have to." "No. Your father didn't have to tow me out of Cedar Run in '82 either." Otis lifted Gideon's duffel from the truck. "Some debts are better paid when nobody is keeping track." Inside, the air smelled of old wood, cold plaster, and dust. White sheets covered the furniture. The kitchen cabinets remained the same dull cream his mother had once threatened to repaint every spring and never did. Vesper entered first. She checked the living room, kitchen, hallway, and back door in a quiet circuit, not searching for danger exactly, establishing the boundaries of a place that would have to earn its familiarity. Gideon understood. Otis had stacked split pine beside the hearth. They opened the damper, cleaned ash from the grate, and built a fire together. The first flame caught slowly. While the stovepipe warmed, Gideon examined the plumbing beneath the kitchen sink. The shutoff valve resisted, then turned with a dry squeal. His father's old toolbox still sat inside the lower cabinet. Gideon opened it. Most of the tools were gone, but a small leather case remained beneath a coil of brittle rubber hose. Inside lay a roll of thin copper wire, darkened with age. His father had carried it everywhere. A machine never failed in the way a manual predicted, he used to say. Sometimes the difference between useless and working was a piece of wire and the willingness to look foolish. Gideon closed his hand around the leather case. For a moment, he saw his father at the workbench, shoulders rounded over a broken pump, humming badly through his teeth. He put the case in his coat pocket. Otis pretended not to notice. By dusk, the house had heat, running water, and one reliable kitchen light. Otis left after refusing supper, promising to return with a replacement gasket for the bathroom faucet. "You need groceries," he said from the porch. "I'll manage." That phrase is why men like us end up eating crackers over the sink. Gideon watched the pickup disappear between the cottonwoods. Behind him, Vesper stood in the doorway, her body outlined by firelight. The silence of the house was different from the silence he had imagined. It was not peaceful yet. It was merely empty. Over the next 3 days, Gideon began reclaiming the place through small repairs. He tightened the porch rail, cleared ice from the gutters, and rehung the workshop door. He bought groceries from the market, accepted 2 repair jobs from men who had heard he knew pumps, and avoided conversations about where he had been. People remembered his name more quickly than his face. Some greeted him with warmth. Others looked at Vesper's harness, then at Gideon's worn green chore coat, and seemed unsure whether they were supposed to thank him for something. He preferred those who said nothing. It was outside the feed store that he first noticed the Labrador. The dog stood over a metal bowl beside the entrance, drinking hard enough to splash water across the concrete. He was yellow, broad-headed, and not old enough to move with the heaviness in his hind legs. His owner emerged carrying 2 sacks of grain. "Duke," the man called. "Leave some for the fish." The Labrador lifted his head, panting despite the cold, then lowered it and drank again. "Always that thirsty?" Gideon asked. The man looked at him, then at Vesper. "Since fall." "How old is he?" 6. Too young, Gideon thought. The man shifted the grain sacks. "Vet says it could be hormones." Gideon nodded and moved on. At Otis's garage, a blue merle cattle dog lay beside a portable heater. Its coat had thinned across the shoulders, and when Otis called it, the dog took several seconds to rise. "Arthritis?" Gideon asked. "Maybe." "How old?" 5. Otis busied himself sorting bolts into a metal tray. "Food's been bad lately. Supply chain, cheap ingredients." The answer arrived too quickly. Gideon did not challenge it. Later that afternoon, he held open the clinic door for a middle-aged woman carrying a trembling spaniel against her chest. Dried vomit stained the fur beneath the dog's mouth. "Been sick long?" Gideon asked. "Just a few days." The woman tightened her hold. "Changed his food, that's all." Her eyes moved away before he had answered. Each incident meant little alone. A thirsty dog, a dull coat, a bad stomach. Gideon had spent enough years looking for patterns to know the danger of creating one simply because he expected it. Still, when he filled Vesper's bowl that evening, he watched her more closely than usual. Water ran clear from the kitchen tap. The faint metallic smell came from old pipes, nothing more. Vesper approached. She lowered her muzzle to the bowl and inhaled for several seconds. Then she stepped back. Her ears moved forward. The muscles along her shoulders tightened slightly. "What?" She looked at Gideon, then at the water. He crouched and smelled the bowl himself, nothing unusual. "Old plumbing." Vesper touched the rim with her nose and pushed the bowl across the floor. The metal scraped against the boards. Gideon studied her. She had refused food before, medicine, the back seat of an unfamiliar vehicle. She had never refused water without a reason. He emptied the bowl and opened a bottle from the case Otis had left in the pantry. Vesper drank immediately. The next morning, Gideon bought 2 additional cases of bottled water. He told himself it was temporary. 2 days later, he and Vesper walked past the Eastern gas station on their way home from Otis's garage. A shallow metal trough stood beside the wall for workers' dogs. A skin of ice had formed around the rim. Vesper angled toward it, then stopped so suddenly the leash tightened in Gideon's hand. She raised her nose. One breath, two. Then she moved sideways, placing Gideon between herself and the trough. Not fear, avoidance. A faint rainbow film shimmered across one corner of the water. It might have been fuel from the parking lot, road salt, grease from a truck. Gideon led her away. That evening, Maggie Dawson's diner was crowded with Calderon workers coming off shift. The windows were fogged and the air smelled of coffee, fried onions, and wet wool. Gideon sat at the counter. Behind him, two men spoke in low voices. "Kidneys failed fast," one said. "How old?" 7. "Lenora know why?" A pause followed. "Could have been anything." Gideon turned slightly. "Dog?" he asked. Both men looked at him. One wore a Calderon jacket with reflective strips across the shoulders. The other kept both hands around his coffee. "The animal that died," Gideon said. "Was it a dog?" The man in the company jacket pushed back from the booth. "Winter's hard on 'em." "That many getting sick?" The booth went still. The second man looked toward the window. The first placed cash beneath his cup. "You just got back," he said. "Give yourself time before deciding you understand the place." He walked out. The other man remained seated for several seconds. Gideon waited. Finally, the man said, "Cold year." Then he followed his companion. Maggie approached with the coffee pot. She was a compact woman with auburn hair tied loosely at the nape and the efficient movements of someone who could carry 6 plates while remembering 3 unfinished conversations. "You scared them," she said. "I asked about a dog. In this town, questions travel farther than answers." "Why?" Maggie filled his cup. "Because answers cost more." She moved away before he could ask what she meant. At home, Gideon lit the stove and checked Vesper's paws for salt. She ate, drank bottled water, and settled near the kitchen doorway. He washed his hands. The faucet dripped after he closed it. One drop struck the porcelain sink. Then another. Vesper lifted her head. Her posture changed. She rose without hurry and stepped into the kitchen. Her right ear stood high. The notched left ear angled toward the sink. One front paw moved half a step ahead of the other. She stared at the faucet. Gideon had seen that stillness before, not during attacks, not when she tracked a person. Before entering damaged rooms where the floor felt wrong, the air carried unfamiliar chemicals, or silence concealed a risk no one had yet identified. A drop gathered beneath the faucet. Fell. Vesper did not blink. Gideon tightened the handle until the dripping stopped. The house became quiet. He poured bottled water into her clean bowl and placed it on the floor. Vesper looked once toward the sink, then lowered her head and drank. Gideon stood beside her with one hand resting lightly on her back. Beyond the window, Larkspur Crossing glowed beneath fresh snow. The square lights burned gold. Chimney smoke rose peacefully against the mountains. Nothing in the view appeared damaged. That no longer reassured him. He had returned believing the town might offer him a life in which nothing depended on his attention. Now, listening to Vesper drink, he wondered whether the town had been depending on people not paying attention at all. Dawson Veterinary Care occupied a low brick building at the eastern edge of Larkspur Crossing, between a tire shop and a row of storage units half buried in snow. Gideon arrived shortly after opening. The clinic sign flickered once before settling into a weak blue glow. Inside the truck, Vesper sat upright in the passenger seat, her black and gold head turned toward the entrance. She had eaten normally that morning and moved without obvious pain, but she had refused the tap water again. Gideon had stopped trying to explain that away. "You're making me look nervous," he said. Vesper touched her nose twice to the back of his gloved hand. He opened the door. The waiting room smelled of disinfectant, wet coats, and the particular anxiety of animals in unfamiliar places. A terrier trembled beneath a wool blanket on one chair. Across the room, a yellow mixed-breed dog scratched its chest until its owner caught both front paws and held them still. Behind the reception desk stood Dr. Lenora Vale Pike. She was 62 and built narrowly, with sloping shoulders beneath dark teal scrubs and a cream turtleneck. Her silver-brown hair was gathered in a loose knot at the base of her neck. Square, amber-colored glasses rested low on her nose, and an old stethoscope wrapped with dark red cloth hung around her collar. She looked at Gideon only briefly before focusing on Vesper. Bring her through. No welcome home, no mention of his parents, no effort to soften the moment with familiarity. Gideon appreciated that. Lenora closed the examination room door and motioned toward the padded table. Vesper placed her front paws on the edge. Gideon supported her hindquarters as she climbed up, careful of the stiffness in her right hip. Lenora noticed. Old injury? Mostly wear. Medication? Anti-inflammatory when the cold is bad. How often this week? 3 doses. Lenora stopped writing. Prescribed schedule? As needed. That phrase has damaged more stomachs than bad food. Her hands moved efficiently over Vesper's body. Eyes, gums, abdomen, joints, pulse. Vesper tolerated the examination without resistance until Lenora pressed near her right hip. Her muscles tightened, though she made no sound. Lenora loosened the pressure immediately. She hides pain. She was trained to keep working. She is retired. Gideon looked at Vesper. I've told her. Perhaps you should tell yourself. Lenora drew blood and collected a urine sample. When she finished, she rubbed Vesper's chest once with the side of her hand, a gesture so brief it might have been accidental. The in-house results will take 20 minutes. She directed them back to the waiting room. By then, 3 more owners had arrived. A broad black retriever stood over a portable water bowl, drinking in long, urgent pulls. Its owner kept refilling the dish from a plastic bottle. Near the hallway, a ranch dog with a red, inflamed patch along its belly shifted restlessly against the floor. Another older dog leaned sideways against its owner's legs, as though balance required assistance. Gideon chose a chair where he could see the room without appearing to watch it. Vesper settled beside him. The clinic door opened and closed. People spoke in low voices about medication, food brands, and winter weather. No one mentioned water. A metallic crash came from the treatment area. Vesper raised her head. The swinging door opened as a young assistant stepped through carrying a stack of towels. For a moment, Gideon could see the kennel room beyond her. Most of the runs were occupied. A hound lay beside untouched food. A shepherd mix paced in a narrow circle. At the far end, a large German shepherd watched the doorway from the shadows of his kennel. He was old, 10, perhaps more, with a silver muzzle and a dull coat that had thinned around the hips. His left ear stood upright. The right folded halfway over, giving his face a permanently uneven expression. When his eyes met Gideon's, the dog moved backward until his body touched the wall. Vesper stood. Easy, Gideon said. She did not pull toward the door. She simply watched the old shepherd with her head slightly lowered. Lenora returned holding a clipboard. Her liver enzymes are mildly elevated, she said. Kidney function is below her previous baseline, but not at a crisis level. Gideon took the paper she offered. How much below? Enough to repeat, not enough to panic. What caused it? Lenora folded her arms. Age, medication, dehydration, stress, environmental change, a combination of those, something else. That is a long list. That is medicine. She pointed toward the values. Stop the anti-inflammatory for now. Bottled water only. We repeat the blood work in 10 days. If the numbers improve, we narrow the possibilities. And if they don't, we keep looking. Gideon glanced through the hallway window. Do you have many dogs with kidney problems? Lenora's expression did not change, but her silence lasted a fraction too long. I have old dogs, she said, working dogs, outdoor dogs, dogs owned by people who cannot afford early testing. That was not what I asked. No, it was the answer I am prepared to give. A low growl sounded from the kennel room. Vesper turned. Lenora followed her gaze. That is Abel, she said. His owner worked maintenance at Calderon. Died 8 months ago. What happened? Heart attack. In his truck after a night shift. And Abel? Kidney damage, poor appetite, fear aggression since his owner died. No family? None willing to take an old dog with medical bills. The assistant opened the door again. Vesper looked at Gideon, waiting. Lenora noticed the exchange. If she goes in, keep her outside the kennel. Abel has bitten before. Gideon unclipped the leash. Vesper walked into the treatment room without looking at the other dogs. She stopped several feet from Abel's enclosure. The old shepherd retreated farther into the corner. Vesper did not approach the bars. She lowered herself to the floor and turned her body sideways, offering him her shoulder rather than her face. Then she placed her head on her front paws. Minutes passed. A phone rang in the reception area. Metal instruments clicked somewhere behind a closed door. Snow slid from the clinic roof with a soft rush. Vesper remained still. Eventually, Abel lifted his head. He took one step, then another. His nails scraped lightly against the kennel floor as he moved forward. When he reached the bars, he did not sniff Vesper or attempt to touch her. He simply lay down opposite her. Their backs aligned on either side of the metal divider. The woman with the scratching dog had followed Gideon to the doorway. She watched the two shepherds in silence. Mine started drinking more in October, she said. Gideon turned toward her. She was in her late 40s, with wind-reddened cheeks and a Calderon badge clipped to the pocket of her winter coat. Her dog leaned heavily against her boots. How much more? 2 bowls at night, sometimes 3. Where do you live? East Basin Road. A man holding the blanket-wrapped terrier looked up from the waiting room. Mine's East Side too, he said, throwing up most mornings. Lenora appeared behind them. The woman faced her. You never said there were others. I never said there weren't. That is not the same thing. No, Lenora replied, it is not. The blunt admission changed the room. One owner mentioned a dog that lost patches of fur near its legs. Another described a cattle dog that became unsteady after drinking from a heated outdoor trough. A rancher said his shepherd seemed worse after days when snow melted along the industrial road. The stories were not identical. That made them more troubling. Gideon asked only simple questions: where the dogs lived, whether they drank indoors or outdoors, whether the symptoms changed with weather or location. He did not tell them what he suspected. The owners did that work themselves. Dogs living mostly indoors and drinking filtered or bottled water appeared less affected. Dogs using yard taps, livestock troughs, and runoff channels had more severe symptoms. Not proof, but no longer isolated accidents. When the last owner left, Gideon stood beside the town map pinned behind the reception desk. Mark the cases, he said. Lenora removed her glasses. I cannot give you patient files. Do not give me names. You are asking me to create a disease map from incomplete observations. I am asking you to show whether the observations are actually scattered. Lenora looked toward the new blood analysis machine in the corner. It was cleaner and more modern than everything around it.
Calderon paid for that, she said. Gideon waited.
They also fund medication for owners who cannot afford treatment, emergency procedures, follow-up testing. In exchange for silence, no one said those words. What did they say? Lenora crossed to a filing cabinet and removed a thin folder. 11 months ago, I sent water from 3 outdoor sources to a private laboratory. They found traces of volatile organic compounds. What kind? Not enough concentration to identify without more testing. Why did you stop? I did not stop immediately. She opened the folder. There were legal letters, polite ones. They reminded me that publicly connecting animal illnesses to an industrial source without conclusive evidence could expose the clinic to a defamation suit. And then Calderon offered help. They had already begun offering help. Lenora's voice sharpened. You think I do not know what that looks like? I think you know exactly what it looks like. She turned away. If they withdraw the treatment fund, some of these animals will not come back. Their owners will wait until they are dying because heat and groceries come first. So you chose the clinic. I chose the animals I could still reach. The words carried no pride. Gideon looked through the kennel room window. Abel remained beside Vesper, his breathing slower than before. He understood the shape of Lenora's choice, not because it was right, but because it had been made under pressure and repeated until it began to resemble necessity. Mark the locations, he said. Keep every name private. Lenora stood motionless for a long time. Then she took a red pencil from the desk. The first mark went on East Basin Road. The second landed near the old industrial access route. By the time she finished, most of the red dots formed a broken crescent across the eastern side of town. Lenora stared at it. I told myself the cases only looked connected because I saw all of them. Maybe they are not connected. She looked at him. You do not believe that. I believe we need better information. That evening, Gideon found 2 unused glass bottles in Otis's workshop. He cleaned them, labeled one Rourke House and the other East Station, and wrote the collection times in his field notebook. He knew the samples would have no legal value, no certified containers, no formal chain of custody, no independent witness. They were not evidence. They were a question placed in a bottle. Otis caught him filling the second one at the gas station tap. What are you doing? Taking water? I can see that. The old man stood beneath the station light, his brown coat open over faded overalls. The red-handled wrench rested in his pocket, though there was nothing nearby to repair. You just got home, Otis said. You do not understand what Calderon holds together. Tell me. 400 paychecks, fire equipment, winter fuel, medical coverage for retirees. Loans when the bank will not touch someone. That does not make the water safe. No. The answer came quietly. Gideon capped the bottle. Do you believe it is safe? Otis looked toward the illuminated plant beyond the road. He did not answer. The next morning, Gideon returned to the clinic for Vesper's printed results. In the kennel room, an assistant slid a clean metal bowl into Abel's run and filled it from the utility sink. Vesper approached the bars. She lowered her nose toward the water. Then she stepped back. Abel rose and moved toward the bowl. Vesper shifted sideways and stood between him and the water. She did not growl. Her fur remained flat. She simply planted her feet and refused to let him pass. Vesper, Gideon said softly. She looked at him but did not move. Lenora entered the room. For several seconds she watched the 2 dogs. Then she removed the bowl. She rinsed another dish, opened a bottle of water from the clinic refrigerator, and poured it in. Vesper stepped aside. Abel lowered his head and drank until the bowl was empty. Lenora stood with the bottle still in her hand. The room seemed to wait with her. Finally, she said, "I will contact a laboratory outside Calderon's network." Gideon said nothing. "We collect properly," she continued. "Certified bottles, multiple sites, no conclusions before results." Agreed. Lenora looked toward the red-marked map beyond the doorway. "I should have done it sooner." Gideon watched Abel settle beside the bars again. "Do it now." For the first time, Lenora did not defend the difference. The laboratory report arrived before sunrise. Gideon found it waiting in his inbox while the coffee brewed and the house settled against the cold. Outside, snow pressed softly against the kitchen windows. Vesper lay near the stove, watching him over the edge of her front paws. The report was only 4 pages long. He read it twice. Both water samples contained traces of volatile industrial solvents. The sample taken from the East Basin gas station also showed a corrosion-inhibiting compound at a concentration several times higher than the sample from his house. Below the results, the laboratory had printed the limitations in bold. The bottles were not certified for environmental sampling. Collection conditions had not been independently witnessed. Temperature control could not be verified. Cross-contamination could not be ruled out. The final sentence was the most important. These results should not be interpreted as evidence of regulatory noncompliance. Gideon closed the report. Years earlier, he would have seen only the highlighted compounds. He would have treated the warning as confirmation that the threat was real and delay was dangerous. But he had spent too many years watching bad information become irreversible action. He looked at Vesper. "This does not prove anything." Her right ear moved slightly. "It tells us what to ask next." That distinction felt unsatisfying. It also felt necessary. Lenora read the report in her office later that morning. She removed her amber-framed glasses, cleaned them with the hem of her dark teal scrub top, and returned to the first page. "You understand why this cannot leave the room as an accusation," she said. "Yes." "You say that very easily." "Would you prefer I argue?" "I would prefer you not become reasonable only after frightening me." Vesper rested beneath the chair beside Gideon. Abel was visible through the narrow window in the office door, lying near the front of his kennel instead of hiding at the back. Lenora replaced her glasses. "I know someone at the State University." "A laboratory?" "A hydrologist." Gideon waited. "Dr. Naomi Greer. She studies groundwater movement in cold regions. Before that, she served in the Army Corps of Engineers." "That is supposed to make her trust me?" "No. It is supposed to make her recognize your worst habits." Naomi arrived in Larkspur Crossing the following afternoon in a mud-streaked university utility vehicle. She parked behind the clinic, stepped out, and immediately checked the condition of the snow around the tires before opening the rear compartment. Gideon watched her lift a silver equipment case onto the bumper. She was 46, compact and athletic, with warm brown skin and dark hair cut in an uneven bob that brushed her jaw on one side and tucked behind her ear on the other. A small mole sat beneath her left eye. Clear, protective glasses rested on top of her head, and the field jacket she wore was the muted green of dried sage. Colored strips of tape covered the equipment case. Naomi did not shake Gideon's hand until she had examined both bottles he had used. "Household glass," she said. "Unused." "That does not make it certified." "I know." "Rinsed with?" "Distilled water." "Stored at what temperature?" "In a cooler." "What temperature?" "I did not record it." She looked at him for the first time. "Then these samples tell us there may be a question. They do not tell us the answer." "That is why you are here." "No. I am here because Lenora sent me a map showing a cluster of animal illness near a municipal well field." Naomi picked up the red-marked town map and unfolded it across the hood of her vehicle. "What were the selection criteria?" she asked. Lenora joined them, fastening her faded brick-red coat. Kidney dysfunction, abnormal liver values, excessive thirst, unexplained dermatitis, persistent vomiting, and neurological imbalance. Over what period? 14 months. Were all dogs tested the same way? No. Were indoor and outdoor animals separated? Not formally. Any livestock data? Scattered. Naomi traced the broken crescent of red marks with one gloved finger. This could indicate exposure, she said. It could also indicate housing age, income, access to veterinary care, outdoor activity, or where people prefer to take their dogs. Gideon folded his arms. So the map means nothing. It means you do not yet know what it means. Her tone contained no hostility, only boundaries. Naomi opened the silver case. Inside were certified sample bottles, tamper seals, disposable gloves, thermometers, sterile wipes, and stacks of numbered forms. If we sample, every collection point gets coordinates, source description, flow time, water temperature, weather conditions, and a witness. Every bottle is sealed, every transfer is signed. You think something is there, Gideon said. I think your question has survived long enough to deserve competent methods. It was not agreement, it was better. The next town council meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening. Gideon had not planned to speak publicly so soon, but Naomi could not conduct a full system review without municipal cooperation. Private property owners could authorize individual sampling points. Public access taps could be tested. The high reservoir could be approached through state research permissions. The municipal treatment system was different. So Gideon submitted a formal request for independent testing. By the time the meeting began, every folding chair on the second floor of the fire station was occupied. Calderon workers filled 2 rows near the aisle, most wearing Navy jackets with reflective stripes. Ranchers stood along the rear wall. Several owners from Lenora's clinic sat separately, as though arriving together might look like an accusation. Vesper remained at Gideon's side beneath the table reserved for public speakers. At the center of the council dais sat Everett Sloan Danner. The town manager was 58, narrow-faced and clean-shaven, with gray blonde hair combed carefully over a high forehead. His camel-colored wool coat hung behind his chair. A small metal tie clip shaped like Larkspur Crossing's stone bridge held his blue-gray tie perfectly in place. Only his eyes looked untidy. They carried the dull fatigue of someone who had spent years being told that every problem would become a disaster if handled incorrectly. Gideon presented the facts carefully. 2 privately collected samples contained compounds associated with industrial products. The collection process did not meet evidentiary standards. Veterinary cases appeared geographically concentrated, but had not been scientifically linked to the water. He asked the council to authorize an independent sampling program. Everett waited until Gideon finished. Mr. Rourke, he said, the town's annual water quality reports remain compliant with state requirements. I have read the summaries. Then you understand we already use certified testing? I understand the official samples have not addressed the question Dr. Greer intends to study. Everett looked toward Naomi, seated along the wall. And the town is expected to assume the cost? Naomi stood. My university can absorb a portion of the research expense. The town would need to authorize access and provide system records. A murmur moved through the room. Everett folded his hands. Public allegations about unsafe water affect property values, business confidence, and employment. Even an investigation can create panic if people mistake inquiry for proof. I have not called the water unsafe, Gideon said. You have asked the council to respond as though there is reason to suspect it. There is. A man near the aisle rose. He did not wear a company uniform. Grant Hollowell's dark navy cashmere coat was tailored closely through the shoulders, and his silver-streaked blonde hair remained perfectly combed despite the wet snow outside. He removed one leather glove slowly, revealing a blackened silver signet ring on his right hand. May I? He asked Everett. The manager nodded. Grant turned toward the room rather than Gideon. Calderon Thermal Systems takes both environmental safety and public trust seriously. If independent testing would reassure residents, the company is prepared to contribute to the cost. Several workers shifted in their seats. Grant's voice remained calm, almost generous. We would simply ask that all testing be performed by an accredited laboratory experienced in local geology and the compounds used in regional industry. Uncontrolled collection can produce misleading results and unnecessary fear. Which laboratory? Gideon asked. Grant smiled faintly. We have worked successfully with several. Selected by Calderon. Approved by state regulators. That is not the same thing. No, Grant said, but neither is suspicion the same thing as evidence. The sentence landed exactly where he intended. Grant did not insult Gideon. He did not deny the chemical readings. He made the room see a newly returned veteran with 2 questionable bottles on one side and a major employer offering certified testing on the other. Gideon felt the argument tilting, without a single raised voice. Everett called for a vote. The motion to authorize an independent system review failed 4-1. People began standing before the result had finished being recorded. Outside, the wind drove fine snow across the municipal steps. Gideon had reached the sidewalk when a thick-bodied man in a Navy work jacket blocked his path. Raymond Caskill wore a stitched name patch over his chest and a heavy white-gray mustache across his upper lip. At 60, he had the solid build of a man who had spent decades lifting, turning, and bracing against machinery. His fingers were scarred with old burns, and an aged metal coin moved continuously between his thumb and forefinger. Ray Caskill, he said, Union President. Gideon Rourke. I know. Ray glanced toward the departing workers. You believe Calderon is poisoning the town? I believe the water needs testing by someone Calderon does not choose. That answer sounds clean. It is the answer. 412 people work directly at that plant. Gideon said nothing. Another 100 depend on contracts, transport, and maintenance, Ray continued. If production gets suspended, contractors lose work first. Then overtime disappears. Then insurance. I did not request a shutdown. You start saying industrial solvents are in residential water, someone at the state will. If the water is safe, independent testing helps the plant. Ray gave a short, humorless laugh. You were gone a long time. That does not change the sample. No, it changes what you understand about the people behind it. Ray stopped turning the coin. If this ends with layoffs, what is your plan for the families who lose health coverage? Gideon looked at him. He had no answer. Not one he could disguise as a principle. Ray watched the silence settle. That is what I thought. He stepped aside. Gideon remained on the sidewalk after Ray walked away. Vesper pressed her shoulder against his knee. The question had reached deeper than Grant's polished argument or Everett's warning about property values. Gideon had treated clean water as the entire moral equation. Ray had reminded him that truth could arrive carrying bills, canceled prescriptions, and foreclosure notices. He had evidence of a problem. He did not yet have a plan for the people who would pay when it was exposed. Otis was waiting in Gideon's kitchen when he returned home. The old man sat at the table with both hands around a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. His red-handled wrench lay beside the cup. You heard? Gideon asked. Half the town heard before you reached the bottom stair. Gideon removed his coat. You came to tell me I should stop. No. Otis looked toward the sink. I came because you asked whether I believed the water was safe. Gideon sat across from him. For a while, Otis only rubbed one thumb along the chipped rim of the mug. June got sick 7 years ago, he said. Gideon remembered Otis's wife as a loud woman with quick hands who had mailed him birthday cards long after his own mother stopped remembering dates. Cancer? Second time. Otis's voice did not shake. She needed treatment our insurance would not cover. Around then, Calderon had a spill near one of the old storage yards. You saw it? I repaired a snowblower that cleared their service road. There was black soil under the snow, dead grass. A smell that stayed in the machine even after I replaced the belts. What did you do? Reported it. And they paid for June's treatment. Part of it. Otis looked directly at him. They told me the release was minor and contained. A lawyer brought an agreement saying I would not discuss unverified environmental conditions on company property. Did you believe them? Otis looked away. I believed the money could buy her time. The kitchen seemed to contract around the sentence. How much time? Gideon asked. 4 months. Otis did not ask for forgiveness. That made the admission harder to judge. I do not know whether the treatment gave her those months, he said. But I know what 4 months felt like when someone told me I might have none. Gideon looked at the wrench lying between them. How many others signed agreements? I don't know. Maybe none, maybe dozens. Otis leaned back. People here were not all handed envelopes to keep quiet. Some got winter fuel. Some got a loan when the bank said no. Some kept retiree insurance. Some got medicine for a dog they loved more than they understood. And they stopped asking questions. Some did. Did you? Yes. There was no defense in the answer, only fact. Calderon learned what each person could not afford to lose, Otis said. That does not make the silence right. It makes it expensive to break. The next morning, Naomi began the formal sampling program without municipal system access. She had permission from several private owners, authorization to sample the public reservoir outlet, and enough publicly accessible points to compare sources. Lenora witnessed each collection. Gideon carried equipment and recorded details. Naomi did not allow improvisation. At every site, she photographed the location, changed gloves, flushed the tap, measured water temperature, and sealed the bottle with numbered tape. She wrote the time to the minute and made both witnesses initial the form. The first stop was Alder Crown Reservoir. The access road climbed above the town through fir trees heavy with snow. The reservoir lay beneath a pale layer of ice, surrounded by ridges shining in clear sunlight. Naomi collected from the authorized outlet below the reservoir gate. The field readings were unremarkable. At the central treatment plant's public sampling point, the water again fell within expected ranges. The eastern residential endpoint was different. Naomi watched the portable meter stabilize, reset it, and test it again. What changed? Gideon asked. Conductivity. What does that mean? It means dissolved material differs from the earlier source. It does not tell us what material. At a second eastern endpoint, the difference remained. At a livestock tap near East Basin Road, the reading moved higher. Naomi's expression did not change, but she repeated every measurement. Lenora unfolded the veterinary map. The cases curve through the same area. Similar area, Naomi corrected. Do not make the boundary cleaner than the data. Still, she sealed the last bottle more slowly than the others. Beyond the chain-link fence around the East Basin pumping station, a woman stood watching them. She wore a navy parka over a charcoal utility vest. A mechanical pencil rested behind her right ear, and the waterproof notebook was held against her chest. Her chestnut hair was tied low, with a distinct silver streak at the right temple. She was not watching Gideon. She was watching Naomi's sampling points. When Naomi moved toward the eastern pressure valve, the woman's eyes followed before the instrument was even raised. Gideon approached the fence. Can I help you? The woman looked at him, then at Vesper beside his leg. No. You work here? She glanced toward the station. That information is on the gate. A metal placard listed the municipal water department.
Beneath it, smaller lettering identified Mara W.
Sayer, System Operations Engineer. Mara Sayer, Gideon said. Her jaw tightened. You should not draw conclusions from field meters. Dr. Greer said the same thing. Mara looked past him toward Naomi. She knows which points matter. Then she turned and disappeared through the side entrance. The sealed cooler left Larkspur Crossing that afternoon with a contracted laboratory courier. Every bottle transfer was signed, timed, and photographed. Complete analysis would take several days. But Naomi compared the field data before leaving the clinic. The reservoir and central point are broadly consistent, she said. The eastern endpoints are not. Contamination? Gideon asked. Difference. You enjoy that word. I enjoy conclusions that survive examination. Lenora folded her arms. Could old residential pipes explain it? One endpoint, possibly. Multiple sites across separate buildings makes that less likely. So the problem is in the distribution line. Or the source feeding that portion of the system, or a treatment difference, or some combination. Not proof, but the shape of the question had changed. Shortly after 9 that night, someone knocked on Gideon's door. Vesper rose from beside the stove but did not bark. Mara Sayer stood beneath the porch light. Snow had melted into dark spots across the shoulders of her parka. Her face looked more exhausted than it had at the pumping station. She carried a rolled sheet of paper. Gideon stepped aside. Mara entered but did not remove her coat. She placed the paper on the kitchen table and unrolled it carefully. It was an old system diagram, creased at the folds and marked with blue, black, and red lines. She placed one finger over the eastern district. The people living here believe most of their water still comes from Alder Crown Reservoir. Gideon looked at the diagram. Doesn't it? Mara's mechanical pencil remained behind her ear, untouched. Not for the last 2 years. The fire shifted in the stove behind them. Gideon did not reach for the map. Where does it come from? Mara looked toward the kitchen faucet, then back at him. The East Basin wells. Outside, snow continued falling over Larkspur Crossing, covering the streets, roofs, and buried pipes beneath the ground. For the first time, someone responsible for the system had said aloud that the town was not drinking what it believed it was drinking. And Mara Sayer looked less like a whistleblower than a woman who had finally run out of ways to remain silent. Mara Sayer kept one finger pressed against the eastern side of the system map. The kitchen fire had burned low, leaving the room warm only near the stove. Snow tapped softly against the windows, but Mara had not removed her parka. She stood as though sitting might make what she had come to say more permanent. Gideon studied the colored lines. Start at the beginning. Mara drew the mechanical pencil from behind her ear. Alder Crown Reservoir sits north of town, above the Timberline access road. Snowmelt feeds it through most of spring and early summer. For decades, it supplied nearly all municipal demand. She touched the blue line descending toward the center of the map. This transmission main carries reservoir water to the treatment plant. From there, it enters the residential distribution system. Her pencil moved to a cluster of black circles farther east. The East Basin wells were built as backup, drought, wildfire, scheduled maintenance. They were not designed to serve one district continuously. And Calderon? Mara tapped a red branch running from the reservoir line toward the industrial area. They have a separate connection. The original agreement allows them to purchase a limited volume for cooling. Original agreement? The muscles in Mara's jaw tightened. 2 years ago, the reservoir fell after a dry summer. Then an early freeze damaged a section of the northern main. Calderon said they could not maintain production without a larger allocation. What happened if the town refused? They planned to move one production unit to Wyoming. Gideon leaned back against the counter. How many jobs? Calderon said 140. Ray believed it would become more. Mara looked down at the map. The council approved a 6-month emergency operating plan. Calderon received additional reservoir water. The Eastern District moved temporarily onto the East Basin wells. Calderon funded filtration upgrades at the well station. Temporarily? Yes. What ended the 6 months? Nothing. The answer came without emphasis. That made it heavier. Mara explained how the arrangement survived through extensions rather than one permanent decision. The damaged main required further inspection. The reservoir recovered more slowly than expected. Calderon added another production shift and warned that reversing the allocation could trigger layoffs. Each extension lasted 90 days or 6 months. Each was discussed as though it would be the last. The emergency stopped feeling like one, Mara said. It became operating procedure. Gideon looked toward the kitchen faucet. And the filters? 2 carbon vessels and 1 aeration unit. They performed within design limits during the first year. After that? Replacement media was delayed. Calderon questioned the cost. The town delayed procurement. 1 carbon vessel went offline last spring. So the others carried the extra flow? Yes. Could they? For short periods. How long have they been doing it? Mara did not answer immediately. 11 months. The pencil remained motionless between her fingers. Gideon felt anger rise but did not give it a voice. What did the tests show? Official compliance samples stayed within limits. Taken where? The central treatment outlet. Not East Basin. Some residential locations were tested. Before or after the systems were blended. Mara's eyes lifted. You understand more than I expected. I understand timing. She looked away. Before scheduled compliance sampling, we adjusted the system to optimal operating conditions. What does that mean? More reservoir water entered the central line. Pressure stabilized. Mineral content dropped. The samples were diluted. No one used that word. That does not change the water. Mara's fingers closed around the pencil. The instruction was legal. Technically. Was it honest? The question struck harder than he intended. Mara's face changed, not toward anger, but exhaustion. My husband has a degenerative neurological disease. Gideon said nothing. Elias can still walk short distances. Some days he can hold a cup without help, other days he cannot button a shirt. His medication costs more than this house would rent for. She touched the map with the eraser end of the pencil. My insurance comes through the town. And that is why you signed. It is one reason. What were the others? I kept believing the next repair would fix it, the next filter shipment, the next extension, the next reservoir season. Her voice lowered. The endpoint sensors began showing irregular conductivity and organic compound alarms. My supervisor said the probes were old. We recalibrated them. When they alarmed again, we blamed winter temperatures. You believed that? I believed it could be true. That was not the question. Mara looked directly at him. No. I did not believe all of it. The kitchen went quiet. Vesper had risen near the stove. She stood beside Gideon without approaching Mara. Mara folded the map halfway, then opened it again. I knew the system was being operated beyond its intended design. I knew the Eastern readings were not reflected in the public summaries. I did not know animals were becoming sick. You saw Lenora's map? Yes. And Naomi's field readings? Yes. What changed? For the first time, the numbers had bodies attached to them. The next morning, Naomi spread Mara's diagram across the examination counter at Lenora's clinic. Vesper lay on a mat near the wall, while Abel watched from his kennel. Lenora stood with both hands around a mug of coffee. her red-wrapped stethoscope hanging over one shoulder. Naomi studied the lines in silence. "If the Eastern District shifted to sustained groundwater use," she said, "the pumping itself may have changed subsurface flow."
Mara frowned. "Explain."
Naomi opened a geological survey on her laptop. "Groundwater does not move according to property boundaries. Increased withdrawal lowers pressure around a well field. If a historical contaminant source exists west of East Basin, the pumping gradient could pull it toward the wells." "From Calderon's old storage area?" Gideon asked. "Possibly. Otis saw a spill there 7 years ago. One observation does not establish the size, compound, or direction. What would? Historical monitoring records, well pumping volumes, soil samples, groundwater samples from the industrial parcel." Mara pointed to a square near the northern line. "The North Control Station might help." Naomi looked at her. "Why?" "There is an isolated transmission route from Alder Crown to the central treatment plant. It was shut down during the emergency conversion, but never removed." "Can it still operate?" "I do not know. It needs inspection." Gideon looked toward Vesper. "When?"
Mara hesitated only briefly. "Today."
The road to the mountain control station climbed through forest bright with fresh snow. Sunlight reflected so fiercely off the slopes that the landscape seemed almost clean enough to deny everything discussed below. Mara drove the municipal utility truck. Naomi sat beside her with the silver sample case between her boots. Gideon followed in Otis's pickup, with Vesper in the rear. The control station was a low, concrete structure built into the hillside beneath Alder Crown Reservoir. Metal stairs descended along exposed pipes and valve housings, all glazed with clear ice. Mara changed as soon as she entered the site. At Gideon's kitchen, she had seemed burdened by every word. Here, surrounded by gauges, pressure lines, and labeled controls, she became precise. She checked vibration through the pump housing with 2 gloved fingers. She compared gauge readings to handwritten values in her waterproof notebook. She explained each valve without simplifying her language for Gideon. "This wheel isolates the northern transmission line," she said. "The line runs downhill to the central plant, but the lower section crosses Calderon's leased parcel." Naomi photographed the maintenance plates. "When was it last pressure tested?" 26 months ago. "Before the switch?" "Yes." Mara stepped onto the lower stair to inspect a frozen valve tag. Her boot slipped. The movement was small at first, a sharp loss of balance, one hand grabbing the rail. Then her glove slid across the ice. The safety strap clipped to her parka caught briefly on a pipe bracket. The stitching tore. Mara dropped to one knee and began sliding toward the edge of the platform. Gideon moved. Vesper moved first. She stepped below Mara's path, planted her front legs wide, and caught the loose strap in her jaws. The force pulled the dog several inches across the ice. Her claws scraped against the metal. The strap tightened. Mara stopped. Gideon reached her, caught the back of her parka, and dragged her toward the railing. Naomi seized Mara's forearm from above. For several seconds, they remained crouched together. "You hurt?" Gideon asked. Mara shook her head, breathing hard. Vesper still held the strap. "Release." She opened her jaws. Mara sat against the railing. Her face had lost its color. Vesper stepped closer but did not crowd her. Mara removed one glove and extended her hand. The dog sniffed it. "You did not know me," Mara whispered. Vesper touched her nose to Mara's palm. The gesture lasted only a second, but Mara's eyes filled before she turned away. Gideon pretended to inspect the torn stitching on the parka. Some forms of dignity required not being observed too closely. Inside the control building, Mara showed them the isolation valve for the old northern line. Rust covered the wheel, but the flange and housing appeared intact. Naomi checked the maintenance log. If the lower section is sound, this could restore reservoir supply. "Not immediately," Mara said. "The line must be pressure tested, flushed, and disinfected. The central plant has to process the water before it enters distribution." "How long?" "Days, if damage is limited. Longer if the Calderon section has failed." "And we cannot inspect that section?" Gideon said. "Not without permission or an emergency access order." Naomi closed the logbook. "Then we need data strong enough to justify one." They left the station in late afternoon. Near the lower access road, Gideon stopped to secure a loose latch on Naomi's equipment case. Vesper moved only several yards away, following the edge of the plowed snow. He heard lapping. She had lowered her muzzle into a shallow pool where sun had melted snow beside a drainage grate. Vesper. She raised her head. Gideon crossed the distance quickly and pulled her back. The water looked clear, but a dark residue stained the gravel beneath it. He wiped her muzzle with a clean cloth. "How much?" Naomi asked. "Not much." Mara looked toward the industrial access road below. "It could be road runoff." "Yes," Gideon said. He wanted the ordinary explanation to be true. That evening, Vesper did not finish her food. She shifted twice beside the stove and stretched her neck forward as if trying to settle her stomach. Gideon offered bottled water. She took several mouthfuls, then turned away. An hour later, she vomited. The first time held partially digested food. The second contained clear fluid and a narrow streak of red. Gideon wrapped her in a blanket and carried her to the truck. Lenora met them at the clinic wearing winter boots beneath her sleep clothes and an old coat thrown over her shoulders. She directed Gideon toward the treatment room without greeting him. Vesper stood for the catheter but leaned heavily against Gideon's leg. Lenora inserted the intravenous line, gave anti-nausea medication, and drew blood. "Back up," she told Gideon. "I am not interfering." "You are occupying the space where I need to work." He stepped away. Vesper watched him until Lenora finished. The initial blood work returned 20 minutes later. "She is not in kidney failure," Lenora said. "Her values are stressed but not catastrophic." "The blood?" "Likely gastric irritation. Anti-inflammatory medication can damage the stomach lining, even after it is stopped. Whatever she drank may have triggered a stronger reaction." "Can you prove it came from the water?" "No." Gideon's jaw tightened. Lenora saw it. "Do not ask me to say what I cannot know." Naomi arrived after Gideon called her. Mara came shortly afterward, still wearing the parka with the torn safety strap. "We release everything," Gideon said. "The preliminary report, the veterinary map, the operational changes. We force the state to stop Calderon until this is resolved." Naomi set her sample case on the floor. "No." Gideon turned toward her. "You saw the model." "I saw a plausible mechanism. Vesper is on a fluid line, and that does not identify Calderon as the source of this exposure. We know their products are appearing in East Basin. We know compounds associated with industrial use appeared in inadequate preliminary samples. The certified results are not complete." Mara stood near the wall, pale but steady. "If Calderon shuts down tomorrow, the Eastern District still uses those wells," she said. "Closing the plant does not reopen the old line. It stops them taking reservoir water. Not immediately. Allocation changes require system adjustments, and if they cut production, hundreds of people lose shifts before we have clean water ready." Gideon's voice rose. "So we wait while more animals get sick?" "No," Naomi said. "We build evidence and a replacement supply at the same time. They have had 2 years, and you have had 2 weeks." The words stopped him. Behind the glass partition, Vesper shifted on the recovery blanket. The fluid line moved softly against the stand. Gideon entered the room and sat on the floor beside her. She raised her head, but the effort seemed to cost her. He rested one hand beneath her collar. For years, he had survived by reducing chaos into objectives. Identify the danger, secure the route, remove the obstacle. But Calderon was not only an obstacle, it was wages, insurance, pension accounts, snowplows, medicine, and debt. The town had grown around the company until danger and survival shared the same pipes. If Gideon attacked without a replacement plan, the people drinking unsafe water might also be the first people to lose the means to leave, seek treatment, or keep their homes warm. Vesper leaned her muzzle against his wrist. He wanted a clean enemy and a clean decision. Instead, he had a sick dog, an uncertain source, and a town trapped between two kinds of harm. Gideon lowered his forehead to hers.
"This is not a mission," he whispered. Vesper's breathing remained slow beneath his hand. For the first time since he had begun asking questions, Gideon understood that proving the truth would not be enough. He would have to find a way for the town to survive it. Naomi's preliminary model did not look dramatic. There were no flashing warnings, no red skulls, no single line pointing from Calderon's plant to a row of sick animals. Instead, the screen showed contour lines, pumping rates, fractured rock, and a shaded plume that widened beneath the eastern side of Larkspur Crossing. Gideon stood beside the examination counter at Dawson Veterinary Care while Naomi moved through the data. Mara remained near the wall, her waterproof notebook held closed against her chest. Lenora watched from the doorway to the recovery room, where Vesper slept beneath a gray blanket. Naomi enlarged the oldest geological layer. The former Calderon storage yard sat here, she said. Underground tanks, transfer lines, and a maintenance pad. The records indicate the tanks were removed more than a decade ago. Records provided by Calderon? Gideon asked. County permitting records, they show removal, not soil conditions. She added the East Basin pumping history. The shaded plume shifted. When the wells operated only as backup, regional groundwater moved mostly south and west. 2 years of continuous high-volume pumping could have altered the gradient. Mara leaned closer. Pulled the groundwater toward the wells. Possibly. And the contamination with it? Possibly, Naomi repeated. Gideon touched his thumb to the crooked bridge of his nose. What would turn possibly into something useful? Soil samples from the former tank field. Groundwater from the monitoring wells on Calderon's lease. Historical pumping data, maintenance records, a complete chain of custody. What does the model prove now? That there is a credible pathway between a potential industrial source and the affected residential area. Enough for the state? Enough to ask a lawyer? The county courthouse stood 40 miles south, in a larger town where the roads were salted clean and the public buildings had glass doors instead of warped wooden frames. Celeste Wardell's office occupied the 3rd floor. A silver pin shaped like a water drop rested on the lapel of her charcoal blazer. Her black and silver hair was cut close to the nape, and the deep crease between her eyebrows made her appear skeptical even when she was silent. A worn red leather case sat on her desk. Celeste read Naomi's assessment twice before looking up. You entered Calderon property? No, Gideon said. Removed equipment? No. Accessed private records? No. She turned to Mara. You signed the operating reports? Yes. Did those reports represent the conditions at the eastern endpoints? Mara held the mechanical pencil so tightly that the yellow barrel bent slightly beneath her fingers. Not completely. Celeste waited. Mara drew a breath. No. Were you aware of that when you signed? Gideon shifted in his chair. Celeste raised one hand without turning toward him. Do not answer for her. Mara's face had lost color. Yes, she said. I knew the reports did not reflect the worst conditions. The silence afterward felt formal, almost contractual. Celeste placed Naomi's assessment inside the red case. Mr. Rourke, you have no authority to enter Calderon's leased parcel.
Dr. Greer's model supports further investigation, but does not identify a source conclusively. Veterinary records may demonstrate a health pattern, but they cannot substitute for environmental evidence. She looked toward Lenora. Any animal data must be anonymized. It will be, Lenora said. To obtain a limited inspection order, I need Dr. Greer's sworn risk assessment, your clinical summary, and Mara's statement regarding filtration, sampling, and allocation changes. Mara looked down. What happens to me? Celeste did not soften her voice. You may lose your position. Your professional license may be reviewed. Calderon and the town may argue that you knowingly certified misleading information. My husband's insurance is through the town. I understand. No, you understand the sentence. You do not understand the cost. Celeste held her gaze. You are right. I do not live with that cost. But I will not promise protection I may not be able to deliver. Gideon had expected law to feel like a weapon once placed in the correct hands. Celeste made it feel like a narrow bridge with no railing. I may be able to seek an emergency inspection, she continued. Limited locations, limited duration, no shutdown order. If any of you make public accusations before the evidence is secured, Calderon may seek an injunction and argue that the investigation has been contaminated by publicity. So we stay silent, Gideon said. You stay precise. Mara did not sign that day. On the return drive, she asked Gideon to stop at a small house above East Basin Road. The wheelchair ramp had been cleared carefully, though new snow already covered its edges. Elias Sayer sat beside a wide front window with a blue-gray cardigan buttoned over a soft cream shirt. At 52, he still had the broad frame of a man who had once been physically strong, but illness had thinned his neck and softened his shoulders. One hand trembled around the large handle of a dark blue ceramic mug. His eyes remained steady. Mara placed Celeste's statement on the dining table. Elias read the first page slowly. If I sign, Mara said, I may lose the job. He nodded. The insurance could end. I know. You need the medication, therapy, and home visits. I know that too. Her voice tightened. You say that as if knowing the price is the same as paying it. Elias set the mug down with both hands. No. His speech moved carefully, each word passing through visible resistance. You pay it every month. Every phone call, every appeal, every time you pretend not to be afraid when the pharmacy says authorization expired. Mara turned away. I did this for us. You did. And now everyone will say I helped them lie. You did that too. The bluntness struck her harder than accusation would have. Elias reached for her hand. His fingers shook against hers. I am afraid of losing treatment, he said. I am not asking you to be fearless. Then what are you asking? Stop protecting me by making everyone else carry the risk. Mara's eyes filled. Elias continued. If you keep signing because I am sick, then my illness becomes part of what is hurting them. That is not your fault. No, but it cannot remain your excuse. For several moments, neither moved. Then Mara drew the mechanical pencil from behind her ear. She signed the statement. The retribution began before Celeste filed anything. Calderon called it a budget review. A public notice announced that community expenditures would be reassessed due to operational uncertainty. Funding for Lenora's clinic was partially suspended. Winter fuel assistance would be reviewed at the end of the month. Production managers were instructed to prepare contingency schedules if water access became restricted. No sentence mentioned Gideon. No sentence had to. By evening, his name filled the diner, the union office, and the comment section beneath the town bulletin. At the clinic, Lenora received 5 calls from owners asking whether subsidized medication would continue. 2 canceled appointments after learning the answer was uncertain. Ray Caskell found Gideon in the clinic parking lot. The union president held a printed shift schedule in one scarred hand. His old union coin moved rapidly between the fingers of the other. 20% reduction, he said. Gideon took the page. Contractors disappeared from the first week. Overtime vanished from the second. Several departments were marked for rotating furloughs. "This is pressure," Gideon said. Ray's face reddened. "That is a clean word for someone whose paycheck is not on the page. I did not ask them to cut shifts. You gave them the reason. Management made the decision, and workers carry it." Gideon looked toward the clinic window. Vesper was visible inside, lying on her blanket. Ray stepped closer. "You told the council you wanted testing. Now people are calling my office asking whether they should fill prescriptions before their coverage changes." Gideon handed the schedule back. "I do not have a plan for them." Ray stopped turning the coin. The anger in his face shifted, unable to find the defense it expected. "What? You asked me before what happens to the people who lose insurance. I did not have an answer. I still do not. Then why should anyone follow you?" "They should not." Ray narrowed his eyes. "I am not asking anyone to follow me." The wind pushed dry snow across the pavement between them. Gideon continued. "I am asking what has to be protected before people can afford the truth." Ray stared at him for a long moment. "Health coverage," he said finally. 90 days at minimum if shifts are reduced. Pension accounts separated from company leverage. No asset transfers while the investigation is active. "Can the union demand that?" "We can demand anything. Winning is different." "What else?" Ray looked toward the Calderon plant. "There have been complaints from workers." "What kind?" "Rashes, headaches, numb fingers, tremors, balance trouble in older maintenance crews." "Reported where?" "Company clinic." "And the findings?" "Age, dehydration, heavy labor, poor sleep." "Do you believe that?" Ray closed his fist around the coin. "I believed it was possible." Gideon heard Mara's words inside the answer. Ray looked tired rather than angry now. "They made us defend them using information they controlled." He folded the shift schedule. "I will speak to the crews, not for you." "For them." "That is the only reason." Inside the clinic, Vesper was improving. Lenora had removed the intravenous line, though a white bandage remained around her front leg. She ate small pieces of boiled chicken and could walk the length of the treatment room before tiring. Gideon slept in the vinyl chair beside her enclosure. Near midnight, Lenora came in with 2 cups of coffee and lowered herself against the opposite wall. "You are frightening the furniture," she said. "I am sitting." "You sit like the chair has confessed to something." Vesper slept between them. Gideon looked at the bandage on her leg. "I brought her here." Lenora waited. She did not choose this town. No, she did not choose that water. No, if I had stayed away, then some other dog would still be sick. That does not make this hers. Lenora took a slow drink. "What are you actually afraid of?" "Losing." "Calderon?" Gideon shook his head. "Her." The answer left him quieter than he expected. "I have taken her into places where people were shooting because that was the work. She trusted me to decide the risk." "And now?" "Now I do not know whether I am protecting her or making another mission, because I do not know how to live without one." Lenora looked through the glass toward Abel, asleep near the front of his kennel. "Vesper did not choose polluted water," she said. "But she has chosen you for years. That does not give me the right to place her in danger. No. It gives you the obligation to stop confusing love with control." Gideon looked at her.
You cannot promise no one will be hurt, Lenora continued. Not Vesper, not Mara, not Ray's workers. Your responsibility is to tell them what the risk is and let them decide whether they stand with you. Vesper opened her eyes. Gideon placed his hand near the edge of the blanket. She pressed her muzzle against his fingers.
The next morning, he stopped asking people whether they were ready to expose Calderon. He asked what they needed first. Ray needed temporary insurance protection, pension safeguards, and a strategy for workers whose shifts might disappear. Lenora needed an independent medication supplier and emergency funds for owners who could no longer afford treatment. Mara needed separate legal counsel and written whistleblower support. Naomi needed trained witnesses, certified transport, and access to Calderon's monitoring wells. Celeste needed sworn statements and records strong enough to survive the first challenge. Otis offered to contact retired mechanics who knew the older pumps, valves, and transmission lines. Maggie Dawson organized a private list of residents willing to distribute bottled water if public concern became a shortage. No one called it a coalition. No one announced a movement. They were simply answering a more useful question. 2 days later, Celeste called from the courthouse. The judge approved limited emergency access, she said. 48 hours, former tank field, groundwater monitoring points, and the North Transmission Corridor. Calderon may observe, but may not obstruct. Gideon looked toward Vesper. She was standing beside Lenora, eating from a shallow dish. When do we begin? Tomorrow morning. Mara, who stood nearby, had just opened the weather alert on her phone. Her face changed. What? Gideon asked. The forecast. A polar front was moving down from Canada. Temperatures were expected to fall below -20 degrees by the following night, with high winds across the valley. Mara enlarged the system pressure readings. The East Basin lines are shallow in 2 sections, she said. If the flow drops or a filter fails, they could freeze. How many homes? Most of the eastern endpoint. How long before they lose service? 48 hours, perhaps less. Celeste's voice remained audible through the speaker. The inspection order does not authorize changes to municipal operations. Gideon looked at the notes they had assembled: evidence, access, witnesses, insurance, medicine, mechanics. For days they had prepared to prove where the danger came from. Now the system might fail before proof arrived. The investigation continues, he said. Mara nodded. But water comes first. Ray stood in the doorway, the reduced shift schedule folded in his pocket. Agreed. No one looked toward Gideon for another order. Naomi began listing the samples required during the inspection. Mara pulled up the old transmission plans. Ray called the union hall. Lenora began counting bottled water at the clinic. For the first time, Gideon was not the center of the room. He was only one person among several who had decided to carry a different part of the weight. The change felt less like leadership than relief. Outside, the winter sky darkened over Larkspur Crossing. The truth was finally close enough to touch. But before the town could confront it, they would have to keep the water moving. The cold arrived 12 hours ahead of the forecast. By noon, the temperature had fallen below zero. By mid-afternoon, wind swept loose snow across East Basin Road so quickly that tire tracks vanished minutes after they were made. Inside the municipal pumping station, Mara Sayer stood before a wall of gauges while alarms blinked in uneven intervals. Pressure at the eastern endpoints dropped, recovered, then dropped again. Gideon watched her compare the digital readings with the handwritten figures in her waterproof notebook. She wore her navy parka over a charcoal utility vest, and the mechanical pencil behind her right ear trembled each time the building shuddered beneath the wind. "What is failing?" he asked. "Nothing yet." Mara moved to another control panel. "That is the problem." One of the remaining carbon filters was approaching its maximum pressure differential. The water entering the vessel carried more material than the system could process at its current rate. If they continued forcing the same volume through it, the filter bed could collapse or channel internally, allowing untreated water to pass. "If you shut it down?" Gideon asked. "We lose nearly half the East Basin flow." "How many homes?" 218 connections, more if the second filter cannot compensate. Naomi stood beside the sampling table, sealing bottles collected from the outlet manifold. "Do not increase flow through the remaining unit," she said. "You could make the quality worse while the pressure gauge looks better." Mara stared at the control board. "Then we have hours, not days." Celeste Wardell arrived carrying the red leather case beneath one arm. Snow clung to the shoulders of her long charcoal coat. Behind her came Sheriff Cole Harlan, a broad, quiet man in his early 60s, whose primary task was to keep the inspection from turning into a confrontation. Celeste opened the case on the nearest table. "The order is active," she said. 48 hours, limited to the former tank field, designated monitoring wells, and the northern transmission corridor. No entry into production buildings, no seizure of unrelated equipment. "And Calderon?" Mara asked. "Has counsel waiting at the east gate." Grant Hollowell stood beside a black company vehicle when the county team arrived. He wore a new silver-gray safety coat over dark clothes, a black hard hat, and spotless protective glasses. Two attorneys stood near him holding document cases. Beyond the fence, Calderon's processing units released white vapor into the wind. Grant did not raise his voice. "This inspection creates a substantial safety risk during extreme weather," he said. "We have requested a temporary stay." Celeste showed him the order. The request was denied. "Our counsel disputes the county's interpretation of emergency access." "You may dispute it in court. You may observe the inspection here." Grant's fingers moved once around the dark signet ring on his right hand. "The company cannot permit untrained individuals to interfere with active infrastructure. Neither Mr. Rourke nor any unapproved individual will touch your operating systems." Celeste's gaze shifted toward the attorneys. "Any obstruction, alteration of monitoring points, or destruction of records will be documented." Grant smiled without warmth. "Calderon has nothing to hide." "Then preserving it should be easy." The inspection began without another word. Snow had filled the old tank field until the ground appeared smooth and untouched. Naomi used historical site plans to locate the monitoring wells. The first two remained visible beneath steel caps. A third had been covered by a storage pallet. The fourth was buried beneath packed snow and gravel. Otis used a narrow probe to find the casing. "This was not lost by weather," he said after clearing it. "Someone graded it." Naomi photographed the condition before anyone moved the gravel. The well cap was rusted but intact. When she opened it, stale air rose from the casing. "Last maintenance date?" Gideon asked. Mara checked the faded identification plate. 8 years ago. Grant's attorney spoke from several yards away. "That unit was formally decommissioned." "Where is the closure record?" Celeste asked. The attorney searched through a folder. No record appeared. They sampled 3 monitoring wells and 2 shallow soil points near the former underground tank area. None offered a cinematic revelation. There was no open barrel, no leaking pipe, and no pool of bright chemical waste. Instead, the evidence accumulated quietly. A field screening instrument showed increasing organic vapor toward the eastern edge of the tank field. The oldest groundwater well had a faint chemical odor. Naomi refused to identify without laboratory confirmation. Several maintenance entries were missing from the same years when East Basin pumping increased. At the northern transmission corridor, the old municipal line still held limited static pressure, but 2 inspection ports showed corrosion, and 1 expansion joint had shifted under frost movement.
Naomi closed her field notebook. "This supports further investigation," she said. "Enough to close Calderon?" Gideon asked. "No," Grant heard him, "because there is no evidence our current operations caused any contamination." Naomi turned toward him. "There is evidence that historic monitoring is incomplete and that the contaminant pattern may align with groundwater movement from this parcel." "May. Yes," she said. "That word remains useful even when executives dislike it." Celeste instructed the company to preserve all environmental, maintenance, and pumping records connected to the former tank field. She also notified Grant that the county was opening a formal environmental investigation. It was not the victory Gideon might once have wanted. No gates were chained, no executive was taken away. Production continued behind the fence. But the old wells now carried official seals, and the missing records could no longer disappear unnoticed. Before they finished, Mara's radio cracked with an urgent call from the municipal treatment plant. The eastern line pressure had fallen again. This time, it did not recover. They drove back through thickening snow. At the plant, Ray Caskell waited with 12 Calderon workers who had volunteered through the union. Some were mechanics. Others worked pipe maintenance, refrigeration, or industrial controls. They had arrived in company jackets but carried their own tools. Ray stepped toward Mara. "What do you need?" "People who can inspect the northern line without treating it like factory piping." That sounded personal. It was technical. Ray looked at Gideon. "Who is running this?" "Mara." The answer surprised him. Gideon continued. "Naomi controls water safety. You organize the workers. Otis handles the older equipment. I carry what they tell me to carry." Ray studied him, then nodded once. "Good." Within an hour, the plant became an emergency worksite. Mara divided the old transmission line into pressure zones. Naomi established clean and dirty work areas to prevent sampling equipment from being contaminated. Ray assigned crews to valves, joints, and excavation points. Otis inspected the auxiliary pumps with the concentration of a man reacquainting himself with machines he had known when both were younger. Lenora established a distribution station in the municipal garage. Bottled water arrived from 2 neighboring counties. Maggie Dawson organized volunteers to deliver it to residents who could not drive through the storm. Priority went to homes with medically vulnerable adults, livestock operations, and owners whose animals were already ill. Vesper remained with Lenora. She wore a thin charcoal warming coat over her gold and black fur. The bandage from the intravenous line had been removed, but Gideon could still see the clipped patch on her front leg. She watched him from the heated garage doorway. He crouched before leaving. "You stay here." Vesper touched her nose twice to the back of his hand. This time he accepted the gesture as agreement rather than protest. At dusk, Everett Danner arrived at the treatment plant. His camel-colored wool coat was covered by a beige-gray parka unsuited to mechanical work. The bridge-shaped tie clip remained fixed beneath his collar, though his tie had loosened. Ray saw him first. "You have the nerve to come here!" Everett stopped several feet from the crew. "I have the access codes for the original control sequence." Mara turned from the panel. "You told me those codes were archived." "They were." "You told me the archive had been corrupted." "It was not." The room went quiet. Everett took a folder from beneath his coat and placed it on the control desk. Inside were extension approvals, allocation changes, and maintenance deferrals dating back 2 years. "I signed them," he said. "Every extension." Ray's mouth tightened. "We know." "No, you know my name is on them. You do not know why." "Does the reason clean the water?" "No." Everett looked around the room. "I believed Calderon would move production if we reversed the allocation. I believed the town could not survive the layoffs.
Every extension looked temporary. Every delay seemed safer than forcing the decision. "You let the East Side drink backup water for 2 years," Ray said. "Yes." "And now you want credit for showing up with passwords?" "No." Everett removed the bridge-shaped tie clip and placed it on top of the folder. "My resignation is effective tomorrow morning. The county has the original records. I will testify to every vote and instruction I gave." Ray stepped closer. "Working tonight does not erase what you did." "I know." "Do you?" Everett met his eyes. "I hope to live long enough to understand it better than I do now." No one forgave him. Mara took the access codes. Everett changed into borrowed gloves and began carrying equipment. That was all the room allowed him. The first stage was not restoration, it was testing. The crew isolated the northern line, introduced low pressure, and inspected every accessible joint. Rusted bolts were replaced, frozen valves were heated gradually, sediment and stale water were flushed into a controlled holding tank rather than released into the ground. Nothing moved quickly. Every action had to be recorded. Every section had to hold pressure before the next one opened. The temperature continued falling. Near midnight, the old auxiliary pump failed to start. Otis removed the casing panel and studied the brittle wiring. "Control relay is not closing." "Replacement?" Mara asked. "Not here." Gideon opened the small leather case he carried inside his coat. The copper wire his father had saved lay dark and tightly coiled within it. Otis recognized it immediately. "Your father used that to keep machines alive past the point of dignity." "He said dignity was less useful than water." Otis cut a short length, cleaned the contacts, and built a temporary bypass that would allow the relay to engage under manual supervision. "This is not permanent," Naomi warned. "Neither am I," Otis said. "Turn it over." The pump shuddered, coughed, and began moving water into the flushing tank. The sound drew no celebration. They still had miles of line to test. At 2 in the morning, pressure reached the lower transmission section. A buried coupling failed. The report came first as a violent drop on Mara's gauge. Seconds later, someone outside shouted. The crews ran into the storm. Water burst from the ground beside the service road, rising in a white arc before the wind tore it sideways. Where it struck the soil, it began freezing almost immediately. "Close Zone 4!" Mara shouted into the radio. Ray's crew isolated the section, but enough water had escaped to fill the excavation with slush and ice. The damaged coupling lay 4 feet below ground. Gideon grabbed a shovel. Mara stopped him. "Excavation crew first. Use support from the edge." The old version of him would have argued. Instead, he stepped aside for the workers who understood the soil, pipe depth, and collapse risk. Ray climbed into the trench with 2 maintenance men. Gideon hauled frozen spoil away in buckets. Everett carried tools from the heated truck. Otis prepared a replacement sleeve beneath portable lights, while Naomi monitored where the flushed water was going. No one performed heroically. They became exhausted, wet, and irritable. Gloves froze. A cutting tool stalled. One worker cursed Gideon for bringing the investigation to town, then asked him to hold the light closer. At the distribution garage, a young-looking but fully grown maintenance worker named Franklin Moss sat heavily on an overturned crate. He was 34, narrow-faced and shaking harder than the temperature explained. His respirator hung loose at his neck. Lenora approached him. "I cannot breathe." "You are breathing." "I lose this job. My wife loses coverage." His voice accelerated. "They will shut the plant. Ray says they will not, but they will. My father's pension is tied to it. Everything is tied to it." Vesper rose from her blanket. She walked slowly across the garage and stopped beside Franklin. Without looking directly at him, she pressed her shoulder against his shin. He went still. His gloved hand hovered over her back. "Can I?" Lenora nodded. Franklin rested his palm between Vesper's shoulders. Her breathing remained slow. After several moments, his began to match it. Vesper did not solve his fear. She did not make his job safe or his future certain. She only gave the fear somewhere to stop moving. Franklin returned to the worksite 20 minutes later and took over monitoring the temporary pump. By 4 in the morning, the failed coupling had been cut away and replaced with a reinforced sleeve. The line held low pressure, then medium. Mara watched the gauge for 10 full minutes before opening the next valve. A deep vibration traveled beneath the floor of the treatment plant. Everyone stopped. At first, Gideon thought it was the pump. Then he heard it. Water moving through the old northern transmission line. Not splashing, not leaking, flowing. The sound was low and continuous like wind beneath stone. Mara stood before the control panel with one hand resting over her mouth. Ray removed his red knit cap. Otis leaned against the auxiliary pump, too tired to pretend the moment meant nothing. Everett remained near the back wall. No one cheered. They listened. For years the sound had been ordinary enough to ignore. Now it carried the weight of every compromised report, every sick animal, every frightened worker, and every decision postponed until it became a crisis. The first reservoir water reached the central holding tank shortly before dawn. Naomi immediately sealed the inlet and began taking samples. "No residential distribution," she said. "Not until treatment and confirmation." Mara initiated the flushing and disinfection sequence. The water would need to pass through the plant, be tested for microbial safety and chemical quality, and remain isolated until results cleared it. Outside, water trucks continued delivering temporary supplies. The east side would not wake to clean water from its faucets, not yet. But it would not wake to empty pipes either. Gideon walked to the garage as the sky began paling behind the mountains. Vesper stood when she saw him but did not rush forward. She was still recovering, and fatigue softened her posture. He knelt beside her. "We got it to the tank." She pressed her muzzle into his palm. Through the open doorway, Gideon could still hear the northern line carrying water beneath the ground. Calderon remained open. The investigation had only begun. No one had confessed enough to repair the damage, but for the first time in 2 years, clean water was moving toward the town through a route the company did not control. Before Larkspur Crossing could tell the truth about what it had allowed, it had done something more urgent. It had begun making survival possible without permission. The water did not return to East Basin all at once. For 3 days after the northern transmission line began feeding Alder Crown water into the central treatment plant, the eastern neighborhoods continued collecting drinking water from municipal tanks parked beside the fire station, the clinic, and Maggie Dawson's diner. Mara refused to reopen residential distribution until the line had been flushed, disinfected, and tested at multiple endpoints. No one argued with her this time. Naomi collected samples at dawn, midday, and after every significant pressure adjustment. Each bottle was sealed, logged, and sent through the same independent chain of custody. The first results cleared the reservoir source. The second confirmed the treatment process was functioning. The third showed that several eastern pipes still carried residual compounds and required additional flushing. People grew impatient. They were tired of hauling containers through snow, tired of boiling water for washing dishes, tired of seeing White County trucks parked beside familiar buildings, but tiredness no longer overruled the measurements. On the 4th morning, Mara authorized limited service to the first eastern block. She stood at the treatment panel while a technician opened the valve. Water moved into the cleaned section under reduced pressure. Naomi waited at the farthest house with a certified sample bottle. Only after the laboratory confirmed the result did Mara approve the next block. It took nearly 2 weeks to restore safe residential service across the Eastern District. By then, the investigation had moved beyond Larkspur Crossing. State environmental teams sampled soil around Calderon's former tank field and tested groundwater from the neglected monitoring wells. The compounds detected there matched the same chemical family found in East Basin, solvents and corrosion control additives used during the plant's earlier operations. The findings did not produce one clean moment of revelation. They arrived as reports, amended reports, and technical conclusions written in careful language. A historical release had occurred near the underground storage system. The extent of the release had been understated. Groundwater modeling performed years earlier had warned that sustained pumping from East Basin could alter the contaminant plume. Calderon had possessed enough information to recognize the risk. The company had not provided that information to the town when it negotiated the increased reservoir allocation. Grant Hollowell was suspended by Calderon's corporate office before the state announced formal allegations. There was no arrest in the town square, no handcuffs, no crowd. One morning, his name disappeared from the regional leadership page on the company website. 2 days later, attorneys confirmed that investigators were reviewing whether he had participated in withholding environmental records, pressuring local monitoring decisions, and obstructing accurate reporting. Grant released a statement through counsel saying he had acted in good faith to protect jobs and maintain operations. Gideon read it once. Then he folded the newspaper and used it beneath a leaking fitting in the workshop. The statement did not surprise him. People rarely described their worst choices as cruelty. They called them necessity, stability, or responsibility. Everett Danner resigned before the council could remove him. At the public meeting, he stood without his bridge-shaped tie clip. The absence left a pale mark across the fabric where the metal had pressed for years. He admitted signing every extension of the emergency water plan. He acknowledged that the council had relied on central treatment samples while knowing the eastern endpoints did not always reflect the same conditions. "I believed keeping Calderon here was the same as keeping Larkspur Crossing alive," he said. Someone in the back shouted that he had gambled with their health. Everett did not defend himself. "Yes," he replied. The honesty did not earn forgiveness. Several residents demanded criminal charges. Others argued that the entire council had participated. A retired plant worker stood and said Everett had kept his family insured during a medical crisis. The room fractured into competing truths. Everett listened to all of them. He agreed to cooperate with the state investigation and surrendered the archived operating records he had preserved. His role in restoring the Northern Line was included in the official report, but no one treated it as payment for the decisions that came before. Mara faced a professional review of her own. Her license was not immediately revoked, but the engineering board placed her under supervised practice while examining the reports she had signed. The town suspended her from sole authority over sampling and compliance decisions. For several weeks, Mara spoke as though every consequence proved she had waited too long. Elias refused to let her turn accountability into self-destruction. "You are not the only person who failed," he told her one evening at the clinic where Lenora was checking Vesper's kidney values. "And you are not the only person who has to repair it." Mara eventually returned to work under county oversight. She no longer kept the system notebook in a locked drawer. Copies of pressure readings, filtration performance, and sampling locations were posted publicly each week. The first time she pinned a report to the municipal notice board, she stood in front of it for several minutes. Then she stepped aside so others could read. Ray Caskell fought on a different front. Calderon reduced production while the investigation continued, and workers lost hours despite every promise that operations would remain stable. Ray used the threat of legal action and public pressure to negotiate 90 days of extended health coverage for furloughed employees. He also demanded that pension funds be placed beyond direct company control during the litigation. Management resisted. Ray organized meetings, brought in labor attorneys, and refused to let the company frame environmental accountability as an attack on workers. "If they hid risk from the town," he told the union hall, "they hid risk from us, too." Not everyone agreed with him. Some workers blamed Gideon. One man at the feed store told him his brother had lost a contracting job because of the investigation. "You came back and broke the only thing keeping this place alive," the man said. Gideon did not answer that the thing had already been broken. He only said, "I'm sorry your brother is paying for decisions he didn't make." The man turned away without accepting the apology. A week later, a Calderon machinist stopped Gideon outside Maggie's diner and thanked him because his dog's kidney values had begun improving after the water switch. Both encounters stayed with him. Doing the right thing did not simplify how people felt about the person who had helped expose the wrong. At Dawson Veterinary Care, the loss of Calderon funding created an immediate shortage. Lenora cut non-essential expenses, postponed replacing 2 pieces of equipment, and spent several nights calling veterinary organizations across the state. Help arrived unevenly. The county provided a temporary public health grant. A regional animal welfare group donated medication. Residents began contributing small amounts through a clinic fund managed independently from Lenora. No single donor replaced Calderon. That was the point. Lenora created a monitoring program for dogs that had lived in East Basin during the 2-year water switch. Owners received kidney and liver testing at reduced or no cost. Results were anonymized and shared with Naomi's research team. Abel improved enough to leave the rear kennel. His kidney damage remained permanent, and he would need medication for the rest of his life. But he began accepting Lenora's touch. At first, she could rest 2 fingers against his shoulder. Later, he allowed her to examine his abdomen without retreating. He still preferred Vesper. Whenever Gideon brought her for follow-up blood work, Abel walked slowly to the front of his enclosure and lay down near her. Vesper no longer matched his posture through steel bars. Lenora had begun leaving the kennel door open when the clinic was quiet. The 2 old shepherds rested on the same side of the room. Otis chose a colder morning to tell the truth publicly. He stood at a council hearing in his faded overalls, the red-handled wrench tucked into his pocket, and described the black soil beneath the snow at Calderon's old storage yard. He also described the financial assistance for June's treatment and the non-disclosure agreement he had signed. "I knew what the arrangement looked like," he said. "I signed anyway." A woman in the audience asked whether he regretted giving his wife 4 more months. Otis looked down. "No." Then he lifted his eyes. "I regret pretending the price ended with me." His testimony did not prove the contamination. It did something else. Other residents began speaking. A retired worker described company-paid hearing treatment after he raised safety concerns. A rancher admitted accepting a low-interest loan after signing an agreement not to discuss water discoloration near his property. A former council assistant produced emails showing Calderon requesting advance notice of sampling dates. Some stories had legal value, others did not. Together, they revealed a system in which support and silence had become difficult to separate. The town had not been controlled by one enormous bribe. It had been bound by hundreds of small dependencies. Winter passed. Spring brought mud, legal filings, and a temporary shutdown of 2 Calderon production units. Summer brought soil remediation crews and public arguments over whether the plant should ever return to full operation. By autumn, the state had established a restoration fund using Calderon's environmental bond, insurance payments, and court-ordered reserves. Part of the fund supported groundwater cleanup. Part funded worker retraining. Ray insisted that former Calderon employees receive priority for positions replacing water lines, operating treatment equipment, collecting environmental samples, and maintaining public infrastructure. "People who kept the plant running know how systems fail," he said. "Do not waste that knowledge." 10 months after the polar front, Larkspur Crossing voted on the future of its water. The meeting filled the same room where Gideon's first request for independent testing had failed. This time, the proposal created a community water cooperative under county supervision. Sampling would occur at the reservoir, the treatment plant, and multiple residential endpoints. Results would be published online and on paper. No major water user could select the laboratory, collection schedule, or sampling locations. The vote passed. Not unanimously. Nothing important in Larkspur Crossing passed unanimously anymore. Mara became the cooperative's lead operations engineer under an independent review board. Naomi remained an external scientific advisor. Ray represented workers in the transition program. Gideon accepted a maintenance position. The title sounded smaller than what some people expected him to take. That was why he liked it. He repaired pumps, inspected valves, and drove the watershed access roads with Vesper beside him. A few veterans from neighboring counties occasionally joined the inspections, but Gideon refused to name the group or build a program around himself. He had spent enough years living inside missions. Now he wanted work that ended at the end of the day. Vesper recovered, though not completely. Her kidney values stabilized, her appetite returned. The stiffness in her right hip became more pronounced after long walks, and she slept more deeply than before. Gideon shortened their routes. He lifted her into the truck when the snow was deep. She tolerated the assistance with visible disapproval. The following winter arrived gently. On a clear morning after fresh snow, Gideon and Vesper walked into the town square. A public water station had been installed beside the municipal building. The structure was simple: 2 stainless steel taps for filling containers and several metal bowls at ground level for dogs. There was no ribbon, no stage, no speech. Adults moved through the square carrying bottles and insulated jugs. Some greeted Gideon, some only glanced at him. One Calderon worker he recognized turned his face away. Maggie Dawson filled a coffee urn at the upper tap. Lenora stood nearby with Abel, whose faded blue collar had been replaced, but carefully preserved inside her clinic. Mara checked the posted test results beneath a clear plastic cover, even though she already knew the numbers. Ray argued with a contractor about the placement of a snow barrier. The town had not become peaceful. It had become honest enough to disagree in public. Gideon stopped beside the lower bowls. Vesper looked at the water. For the briefest moment he remembered her standing in his parents' kitchen, refusing the first bowl he had filled from the tap. He took a metal cup from the station, filled it, and drank. The water was cold enough to ache in his teeth. Vesper watched him. Then she lowered her head to the bowl. Gideon rested one hand lightly against her back as she drank. No one applauded. He was grateful. Across the square, 2 residents who had avoided each other for months began talking about the cleanup schedule. Their voices rose. Another person joined them. Then another. Gideon understood at last that he had not returned to rescue a helpless town. Larkspur Crossing had never been helpless. It had been frightened, dependent, and practiced in silence. He had only asked the first question loudly enough that others could decide whether to answer. Then, slowly, he had learned to move aside. Snow rested over the bridge, rooftops and mountain road exactly as it had when he arrived. The town was still beautiful. But beauty was no longer being used as proof that nothing was wrong. Vesper finished drinking and touched her nose twice to the back of Gideon's hand. He looked toward the clean water flowing into the bowl. Larkspur Crossing was not healed. The wells would require years of monitoring. The lawsuits would continue. Some jobs would never return. Some illnesses would never be fully explained. But no one had to pretend the water was clean anymore. And no one person had to carry the truth alone. Sometimes the hardest truth is not the one we discover, but the one we finally choose to speak. Larkspur Crossing was not saved by one hero. It changed because ordinary people stopped protecting their comfort at the expense of someone else's safety. That lesson reaches far beyond a town's water supply. In our own lives, silence can feel easier, but courage often begins with one honest question and the willingness to accept what the answer may cost. May God give us wisdom to recognize what is wrong, grace for those who are afraid, and strength to do what is right without needing applause. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe if you would like to hear more stories about loyalty, conscience, and the quiet courage to stand for what matters.